Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the session, A Paradigm Shift in Treasury Technology. My name is Katie Bolt, and I'm the Business Development Associate here at Elire. Just a couple reminders for during our presentation today. All attendees are going to be placed on mute. All questions can be submitted via the chat to panelists or the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. A recording of the session and a copy of the PDF slides will be available in a digital library following the event. This session is available for CTP and CCM credits, and a link to the assessment will be sent out in the chat towards the end of the presentation, as well as in a follow-up with the recording. With that being said, we're going to get started with the session. Ms. Karen Willis has been in the finance industry for 25 years, consultant for global payments, FX, SWIFT, Cloud TMS, and ERP TMS. As a regular speaker at the national and regional finance conferences, she is a respected leader in her field and an Elire founding partner. And Mr. Dayton Paul is the senior consultant with Elire's ERP Treasury practice. He has helped clients implement effective changes to their Treasury departments and has consulted on a variety of topics, including cash management, forecasting, organizational change management, and portfolio maintenance. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Ms. Karen Willis to start the presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the Elire ETE conference. I did want to make a shout out to Seth Marlowe for a wonderful keynote this morning, and it's a perfect segue into this session. What we're really going to do in this session is take the information that Seth provided, and we're going to drill down into a little more detail. So between his session and our session, you really should leave today very well armed for your strategic planning over the next few years. We're going to talk about trends after introducing Elire just for a moment, and we're going to then look at the different business processes that are shown here and the technology that goes with them. So we've paired them together, give you a better sense of what technology goes with what business process. Just a little bit about Elire. We've actually been 15 years in the business, but our core founding partners, we average about 20 years in the Treasury field, so we're definitely specialists. We have over 250 TMS implementations under our belt, and we also do a large number of roadmap engagements for advisory. So we do look at ourselves as our trusted advisors for our customer. You'll also notice that we have several partners listed today on this slide. We are definitely a partner with Oracle. We work very closely with SWIFT. We have a lot of SWIFT experience, about 15 years in that area. And of course, Kyriba and FIS are joining us today. We work closely with their teams on the Cloud TMS area, and they're both joining us for sessions during the conference to present their latest applications. So we thank them for joining us. Our Treasury practices, they do cover advisory services with PMP project management. We still continue to support our on-premise ERP clients. We have a large number of those. And we are very involved in cloud implementation services. And we typically support our clients after the implementation in a managed service capacity. This slide just gives you a very quick view of the breadth of our experience and the number of different industries and clients that we've worked with over the years. So let's talk first about technology trends for Treasury. This word cloud, we like to use word clouds in our consulting practice, but it does actually give you a quick visual of the topics that we're going to talk about today. A number of them Seth mentioned. We're also going to dig into some details, some more detail there. So big data, AI, CAS, SAAS, cloud, RTPs, ISO. We're going to be looking at all of these today and over tomorrow in the conference. So let's start with some trends that are happening right now. It's interesting, but enterprises are actually outpacing consumers on emerging technologies. So APIs, blockchains, RPA, digital assistants, AI, and the Internet of Things are all key areas that enterprises are looking at. This is a statistic that I found really interesting. 60+ open banking platforms already have APIs available, And that is a 73% increase in just the last 3 years. So a lot of this is really happening right now. There's thousands of fintech firms actually, but a number of them that are listed here, and we'll show you later, we'll talk about some of the vendors in this space. They've created a number of blockchain SaaS solutions. Virtual card payments is another area that's very interesting. Over the last 3 years, it has doubled to 160 billion, and it's supposed to be $500 billion by 2024. Very interesting numbers. The Clearinghouse has launched its own real-time payment platform, and the adoption on that is increasing steadily. The US Federal Reserve is coming out now with the FedNow real-time payments. They're actually working to deliver that by 2023. SWIFT is also going to ask all of their member banks this year to confirm payments via the GPI tracker. What's really important about that is there is an end-to-end reference that is carried through the entire life cycle of the payment, and it's very important to reconciliation processes. We'll talk about that later a little more in depth. SWIFT is also expanding its instant payment services, which it has been testing in Europe and APAC successfully. And an interesting note is that JP Morgan is the first US bank to issue a digital coin representing a fiat currency called JPM coin. And just very recently, the US Senate Banking Committee held a hearing on the issuance by the US Federal Reserve of the digital USD. By 2025, these are some trends that are planned for 2025. They're expected that 80% of all enterprise workloads will move to the cloud. Those movements are happening now, but it's something that you should definitely be thinking about in your strategic plan. 90% of enterprises will use SSO and multi-factor authentication. And what this does allow is if there are on-premise applications that still exist, they can connect that security and control with their cloud applications. So it becomes kind of an umbrella. 85% of customer interactions will be automated with RPAs, APIs, and AI. 70% of IT functions will be automated via API and AI. And there should be a 100-time increase in security-related events. And this is where AI and machine learning will definitely come into play. And one very interesting statistic around the blockchain and the Bitcoin and the altcoins is that 10% of the worldwide GDP by 2027 is expected to be stored in blockchain. That's a very interesting number. Today, what we're going to do is take the information presented by Seth, and we're going to use that to connect to the business processes in Treasury and talk in more detail. So the first one we want to talk about, which was mentioned earlier, is robotic process automation. One of the key areas that this can be very, very helpful and have a very significant ROI is in the bank reporting area. A recent survey by Research in Action out of Germany for 1,500 firms showed that 48% of those firms are currently using RPA, and another 40% are planning to use soon. So the growth in RPA is definitely there. It's definitely happening today. As Seth mentioned earlier, RPA really just mimics human actions, and it applies to a business process to automate it. Artificial intelligence is also being paired up with RPA, and the bots are becoming very good at human-level decision-making. So the benefits of the RPA is 24/7, 365 productivity, 100% accuracy, cost reduction, scalability, and you can really transform your treasury process. The best use cases for RPA, currently they're really being used for bank statement retrieval to get rid of that routine task that is performed every day, consolidating the bank statement data, and reporting on it in the form of cash balances. It's also being used extensively in bank reconciliation to achieve matching, so you don't have a human intervention, invoice processing, and customer service in CRM. Now, one of the cautions around the bots is that they are actually another user within the system because they emulate human action. They actually are another user. And you want to make sure that they have credentials and roles just like you're defining for a human being. And really just manage the bots as if you would with any other software system. In order to implement an RPA, the steps that we recommend is to assess automation opportunities. You want to prioritize the ones where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck, especially in the beginning. Develop a business case and select the right tool. We're going to note a number of tools in just a little bit. And you want to build the bots, but you do want to test on a small scale so you can get comfortable with the tool. And then you can grow from there with more significant and complex processes. RPA governance is very important. Sometimes the underlying steps change. You have to make sure that there is monitoring of the bots and that they're routinely being updated to match the business process. Around implementation, an iterative approach is recommended. You can always code what we call the happy path, but you want to make sure that you've added error handling and fringe test cases. The real reason for that is bots can break. They do break, and you want to make sure that they're being fully tested for all different scenarios. You never want to automate a broken process. So as part of an implementation, what you want to be doing is incorporating change management into the project. Very important. You'll notice that 63% of firms don't meet their RPA strategic deadlines, and 40% of those projects fail initially. Those are kind of scary numbers, but if you do incorporate these techniques around implementation, you should be very successful. You also want to make sure, as I mentioned earlier, to pick the right process to maximize your ROI. So pick something that's costing you a lot today in terms of time and cost, and use that to initiate RPA. As part of our session today, we will be presenting the vendors that are highly recommended. Seth mentioned several of these. So the documentation, the presentation will be available after, and we want to put these in here so that you can refer back to them. This particular slide is a combination of study by Research and Action out of Germany, and also the Gartner Magic Quadrant. So let's talk about bank reporting around connectivity as a service, or CaaS. One thing that you want to be aware of with CaaS is if you're moving from an on-premise solution, there are different cloud options available. Single tenancy private cloud is very, very protected. Oracle has recently come out with a private cloud option, which rivals all of their major competitors in terms of speed and safety. It's a very good option, but it does tend to be a much more pricey option, maybe tenfold to what a public cloud is. And it is single tenancy, so you would be the only entity on that particular cloud. There are lots of options today that are multi-tenancy public cloud. And really what that means to you is that you're sharing disk storage, you're sharing an environment, and when there is an upgrade to the system, everyone will go together. So you might be on a schedule that isn't ideal for you, but actually is selected by the vendor for the entire group. So definitely be aware which cloud option you're getting involved in when you purchase an application. Around connectivity as a service, or CaaS, it really is in the cloud. Generally, they're totally in the cloud, And so you can have remote global access by your entire team. There's no on-premise internal IT support costs, which is a huge advantage and why so many firms are moving to the cloud applications. You also get a vendor SLA arrangement where it's 24/7, 365 global monitoring for inbound bank statements. I have many, many clients where this is a huge pain point because they have to monitor themselves and then they have to call the banks and sort out the problems. So the vendors in this case do that for you. Another exciting option with the cloud is that they're connect-ready formats. So there are vendors who have 1,000 banks worldwide where they already have the formats in BAI and Swift MT, the old FIN messages, and Swift MX in the new ISO messages for KMT. So those are ready to go. You connect and you can connect to the banks very quickly. Approximately 10% of the traditional on-premise costs is the cost of cloud for ongoing maintenance. And also the initial connection time for CAS can be as low as 3 weeks versus 3 months in a legacy ERP. And as I mentioned, we are doing both of these, and that is definitely true. I'm a little bit old school for 20 years in the business, and I couldn't believe that 3 weeks was achievable, but it is. CAS also allows you to apply smart rules to the classification of your cash flows and then automate your accounting. And as I mentioned, it does support the new ISO KMT statement. And the reason this is important is when Seth talked about ISO, and it's a global standard, the UETR, or Unique End-to-End Tracking Reference, is a piece of data that is to be carried forward from a payment all the way through to the bank statement. And it's being supported by the CAS vendors. It's also part of the Swift GPI. So it's a very important data element because it's going to let you achieve that automated bank account reconciliation. So let's talk about cash positioning in the SaaS world, software as a service. So the SaaS products, they allow you to take firm cash flows you know are going to happen, estimated cash flows and actual cash flows into a single worksheet. It's also very dynamic, so you can click on each cell, you can see the detailed transactions. You can mix BAI statements with Swift statements. It all works together in a SaaS cloud application. You can view the liquidity balances very quickly by an entity, by bank, by account group, and by account. Makes a really flexible tool and easy to use. You can also change between your firm's reference currency and then quickly change into an in-country view of the localized currency. You also can have multiple views of the cash position worksheet, or CPW. One of the key components that's very useful is the budget category. So if you need to provide that information to the FP&A team according to your budget category, you can also use that beyond the BAI or Swift code option. And you also can use a combination. The views that you can achieve with the SaaS are multi-periodicity, it's hard to say, by day, by week, by month, and you can use a combination where you display, for example, all 3 of those together. The liquidity forecast can be produced for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever you need to do to support your FP&A reporting and your FP&A planning. And there are actually custom color schemes, which really, really help the readability. And this is just a view of one SaaS vendor application. You can see it's very attractive. It's done by day, by week, by month, and then there is a significant amount of drill down. I mentioned as part of this presentation, we're going to be presenting vendors to you. And CAS and SaaS vendors include A number of these: Kyriba, FIS, Oracle, Finastra, Swift, Treasury, Treasury Express, Axle Tree, Bottomline, Bellin. That's just a small sampling, but this is the most prevalent vendors that we see today. So let's talk about in-house banking and how that applies to new technology. Blockchain distributed ledger technology is bringing about a new type of in-house banking. With the distributed ledger technology, you can decrease the cost of tracking intercompany loans and multilateral netting. You can also decrease your labor-intensive billing costs. You can save millions by implementing across a number of subsidiaries, and you can combine with the distributed ledger, you combine blockchain, smart contracts, distributed ledgers, and APIs to achieve the automation. So that is the tools that will be required for the in-house banking. Corporates can also set up their own private permission distributed ledger for the in-house bank. And that really just means that you can have the in-house bank within your organization, and the ledger represents your own in-house bank with all of your subsidiaries being members of the contract. You can, with smart contracts, also automate your regulatory and corporate compliance. That's a key component because you don't have to use individuals for that. The contracts take care of it themselves. And the APIs enable the movement of info into the in-house bank. So foreign exchange rates are an example of spot rates that you can use the APIs for. APIs can also make FX translations, apply interest on intercompany loans, and perform calculations. With the in-house bank and the distributed ledger technology, what you'll be doing is setting up virtual accounts instead of physical bank accounts. You actually, in practice, can close a number of your physical bank accounts. Those external balances will change very infrequently because you'll be doing transactions and recording them within the virtual accounts. The CFO and treasurer can see the balances across the company at any time. It's updated real time. That's been a typical issue, having implemented in-house banks, complex ones in the past, waiting for the batch to run every night and gather all the data to the next day was always an issue. And because you're using virtual accounts instead of the physical bank accounts, you now can significantly reduce your fees with wire transaction costs and margin. It's estimated a 30% improvement in efficiency in Treasury back office processes for in-house banking with the distributed ledger technology. It also gives you more options. You can use a different mix of loans, equity, and even hybrid instruments. And it also allows some other liquidity options in supply chain finance, refinancing, and dynamic discounting. So it's a pretty provocative product for in-house banking, something very new. Around the payments and FX, we want to start by talking with the real-time payment and also application programming interfaces, or APIs, both terms that Seth introduced in his keynote today. For real-time payments, central banks are adopting the ISO standard for real-time payments. There's a huge number of central banks that have already moved to the ISO standard, and by 2023, it's expected that all central banks will have moved. And those are being used, that standard's being used for the real-time payments. SWIFT, as I mentioned, has a Global Payments Initiative, or GPI, and that's becoming the standard for cross-border real-time payments 24/7, and it is using the ISO standard. SWIFT has not really gotten onto the blockchain bandwagon. They're really using their own core architecture, their common standards like ISO, and also the APIs that they have developed themselves. And the Fed, as we mentioned, the Fed Now service is looking to launch in 2023. So that will help the US financial institutions do a 24/7, 365 instant payment service. And just to note, there are many different types. This is a short list of the real-time and instant payments: account to account for bank transfers, B2B for business to business, B2C, business consumer, and person to person, P2P, which is also sometimes referred to as peer to peer. For the APIs, there's a survey that came out which lists the top 3 business applications of APIs. So making payments, 26%, opening new accounts, 25%, and KYC or identity authentication, 12%. So fintechs are also collaborating with a number of other fintechs, as Seth mentioned earlier, and even challenger banks so that they can produce very quickly new customer products. Regulations are also emerging, and it really came out of the Europe driving this with the PSD2 directive, where they are directing the banks to adopt open API systems. And the open banking market, it is still at the beginning. Many banks are developing APIs, but they're really only partially through their modernization programs. So just be aware of that. Your bank may or may not offer an API alternative. All of the major banks are, but not all of the smaller banks are. And the banks are also moving to internal governance, just like recommended for firms internally, so that there's standards around the use and application of an API. So for blockchain, the business applications that are happening today with blockchain is cross-border payments, clearing and settlement, and digital identity management, peer-to-peer payments, and invoice financing. How the blockchain works: so on a cross-currency exchange payment, a firm can initiate a payment, originate in their own reference currency, so say USD or Euro. It does go through a digital exchange, maybe an Ethereum network or a Ripple network, and the original currency is turned into a digital asset. So that might be XRP with Ripple, or Ethereum on the Ethereum network. And then it's translated into the local in-country currencies for the beneficiaries, say if you're paying a third-party vendor. So blockchain terminology, there's a lot to learn around this, but the primary terms that you want to be familiar with when you're talking about blockchain to vendors is, what is a blockchain? It really is just a decentralized database. The idea is that the parties, the underlying theme is that the parties don't trust each other. So what takes over for the lack of trust is a smart contract. So the smart contract is computer code, and what it does is it controls all of the actions taken by the counterparties, just as if they were in a traditional commercial agreement. And Oracle is a new term that's coming out of the blockchain environment, developed over about the last 3 years, not to be confused with Oracle, the software company. In this case, Oracle is a trusted external party. And the reason for an Oracle, since those parties on a blockchain don't trust each other, an Oracle is a source of information. A good example would be an FX spot rate, where everyone within the blockchain sees the same FX spot rates and converts them at the same rate. So if you're making a payment between currencies, cross-currency, and you need to convert, everyone will be using the same information or spot rates. And here's a good example in terms of blockchain. There are inherent rules built in that we mentioned. In a peer-to-peer arrangement, it's really treated as a financial ledger. And what that means is, one of the rules is that the total dollar of funds has to stay in balance. So for example, the smart contract, which is automated computer code, it would check first for sufficient funds, then it would second deduct those from one account, and third add to the second account. So this is what the smart contract and the distributed ledger takes care of for you. It keeps everyone in balance. This diagram just gives you an example of one of those networks. So you can see there's market data that's coming from Bloomberg and Reuters. There are bank payments being transacted. There are also backend systems such as your ERP, like SAP and Oracle, and Salesforce, for example. And you'll notice that there's an Oracle service that interacts between those two endpoints. The center circle really represents one of the blockchain networks like Hyperledger Fabric or Ethereum. And one of the exciting topics in doing our research and preparing for today is the digital USD. This is definitely being discussed. I mentioned that there was a US Senate Banking Committee meeting discussing this topic. It would be issued by the Federal Reserve, and it would be akin to paper currency today, except that it would be digital. The banks would hold the digital currency as reserves, and they would make them available, typically through like an ATM network. They would make them available to customers. The way that they would initiate a digital USD is to utilize the blockchain and distributed ledger technology. They would need that. And something you might not be aware of is recently, on the 30th of August, China has actually developed this technology, and they actually rolled it out for a brief period through the CCB. And they did recall it, but it was a test that they were initiating. So here's a number of digital payment vendors that we wanted to share with you. There is, again, several sources that have scored the fintechs. And the top 8 that are noted right now is Circle, Chainlink, WeTrade, Stellar, and Veeam, and Robinhood and Ripple. There are also ERP vendors. SAP, Oracle, and Microsoft are all heavily involved in blockchain as well. They have their own tools. And the card vendors, MasterCard, American Express, and Visa, they have all recently, in the last, say, 3 to 5 years, they've gotten very significant patents around blockchain and some of these new products that they're developing. We're including this information on each of those 8 fintechs for you, but we're going to just leave that in the materials that you'll collect after the session is over. And I'm now going to turn over to Dayton Paul, and he's going to start talking with you about AI and machine learning.
Thanks, Karen. So I think a lot of us really do realize the importance of machine learning and AI, and I hope to demonstrate some of the most pertinent areas where it really is becoming important for organizations to consider machine learning. And in doing that, I really hope to show you that the learning curve is a lot smaller than many people realize, and it really is an important technology to consider. In terms of overall enterprise sort of effect around payments, we're going to talk about some of the ways that organizations are getting impacted the most when it comes to both payments internally to external vendors, as well as some of their payables and receivables networks, and how those are really being affected on a global scale. So we're going to talk about some of the statistics that were available for 2019 and really how pervasive they are and how many organizations are really being affected by things like payment fraud. So in 2019, we saw 74% of organizations were affected by check fraud. This is one of the most lingering fraud cases, and a lot of organizations continue to experience check fraud. More advanced, we're seeing really now people are being affected by business email compromise, so things like phishing, where external parties are actually getting into internal networks and really causing losses that were not apparent 20 years ago. So these are really things that impact your most essential portions of your business, like ACH and wire. We saw that 54% of companies that were surveyed saw at least some sort of loss that was due to business email compromise in 2019. And of those, we saw 23% actually impacted their wire capabilities and their wire networks. And then another 20% saw losses due to ACH. Not only is this a problem, a lot of the organizations that have really been impacted by this, we see that 33% of them still have not received advice from banking partners on mitigating those risks either. On the other side, we also see a lot of fraud impacting the card payment networks globally. We can see that from 2011 out through 2027, there is a huge projection in billions of dollars of costs being lost due to fraud itself. So we're seeing 6.86 cents on every $100 is being lost to card fraud. In addition to the slide that we saw previously, where 46 cents is being lost due to those frauds that we had previously talked about, we're seeing over 52 cents per $100 of revenue being lost to different types of payment fraud annually. And this is continuing to grow. Not only that, we're seeing it impact really every infrastructure of card networks. So not only those global brands that we're all familiar with, like Visa and Discover, but some of the smaller ones. So ATM branded exclusive credit unions, we're seeing impact there. We're seeing impact on domestic onlys, so things like China Pay, India specific networks, and then even private label brands. So if you're opening a credit card at a store, even those credit cards are being impacted by card fraud. So it really is a pervasive issue both inside and outside of the business. There are really a couple ways that we can go about tackling this as well. So we're not working with our hands tied behind our back here. One of the best ones that we're starting to see and a lot of organizations are beginning to implement is based around AI and machine learning. So what we're able to do is really take a lot of these advanced technologies and learn from past cases where this has happened to our organization or to other organizations. So we're utilizing data from things that maybe not have affected us, but we've seen affect people in our industry or even globally, so that we can really start to define things and allow sort of our machine learning process to actually build cases around those without doing explicit programming. This allows us to use some advanced modeling to develop really real-world based algorithms. So we're no longer hypothesizing and then developing and then reiterating to try to stay one step ahead. We're empowering a lot of our machines off of these models to then go in and start to document these cases as they occur in real time. So now we're working proactively instead of reactively. And this data can continue to be used to reinforce, refine, and develop new algorithms. So as we see new use cases, we're not starting from scratch. We're building on our old cases. We're allowing things to really continue to refine themselves. And that ultimately leads to advanced predictive capabilities in the future to really halt some of the issues that we're seeing if they continue to become more pervasive. And I really want to use this slide to really boil down what machine learning is about. Some of the best algorithms in the world for machine learning are based purely on decision trees, which is something that I think we've all worked with historically. So this shouldn't be a shock of a concept. We all know how powerful decision trees can be, and empowering machines to ultimately utilize those is empowering them to be even better, go even further and do more advanced things that they haven't been able to do historically. And sort of there are three core processes around developing machine learning algorithms in these decision trees, and they all play really important roles, and they all tend to work together. So it's important to consider all three when looking to implement machine learning. Going into each one, we really see the first one as reinforcement learning. So that's where we have a really good idea of how our business is being impacted. We just want to make sure that the algorithm or the decision tree that's developed to really halt any nefarious interactions is ultimately as powerful as it can be. So we're just reinforcing the hypothesis that we already have. Supervised learning is really what I think of as one of the quintessential aspects of machine learning. So there's this thing called underfitting or overfitting, where you're developing a new algorithm where it tends to either really make too many decisions and get too granular, or it stays too general. With supervised learning, we start to make sure that we're fitting it to the exact level. Since we're using historic cases, we ultimately don't want every case to be defined one-to-one for a decision, because then it wouldn't apply to future examples. So we really need to make sure that it's not overfitted. And then unsupervised learning is really when we deploy any of the algorithms and machine learning capabilities into the real world, where they're really starting to interact with new cases and new events occurring on a daily basis. And we're allowing that machine learning capability to continue to grow upon itself, so that as it encounters new and unique threats, it's becoming more powerful, and it's not relying on individuals to go in and change things or update material. And one of the important aspects of that, and what we've talked about previously, is obviously our ERP integrations and how we can utilize all of this material to ultimately empower our ERP to do more efficient and better utilized aspects. In terms of payments, really where we are right now, many ERPs have decided not to build and support their own bank connectivity platforms, and corporations then develop and spend a lot of time developing their own communication to those banks, which is extremely high cost to own, extremely high initial development, and totally kind of outside the bounds of where we think the future is heading. And then there's some other aspects too, where we're starting to move. So vendor outbound payment services being in the cloud, allowing accessibility and remote staff to be able to interact with the system as a whole from anywhere at any time, whenever they ultimately need to be in there. Global monitoring has advanced as well. So no longer is it manpower oriented, but a lot of these
It looks like Dayton's just getting reconnected with his audio. It'll just be 1 second.
Apologies for that, everybody. I've been dealing with some inclement weather, so we're having some connectivity issues on my end. But to kind of round out the last of our topics here and go ahead and hop on to some of the other important material that we have. So we're seeing a lot of changes now occurring and moving forward in the future. And really, this is impacting a lot of the CAS and SAAS material that we were able to touch on a little bit earlier. So really allowing more payment types, more availability, a lot of on-premise IT solutions, allowing greater protocols and connectivity controls to really control the business continuity and security at a more advanced and technologically skilled level. We're also seeing a lot of communication and connectivity with Swift being improved, allowing vendors to actually access Swift Service Bureau. And then, of course, we're seeing a lot of the advancements that we've talked about previously with the payment fraud detection and sanction screening, utilizing AI and machine learning to really provide solutions at an enterprise and vendor-specific level. One of the great things about some of the big data, machine learning, and analytics capabilities that we're all seeing in the industry today is it's allowing a lot of decisions to be and a lot of data to be given to C-suite, senior managers, and people at the managerial level to drive more important and more powerful decisions. Big data really refers to things with what we like to call the 3 V's. So our high volume, high velocity, and high variety sorts of data, as well as that data coming in either unstructured or semi-structured. So these are things that are really narrowing down the sort of cost that it would take to implement strict APIs to map one-to-one for our traditional relationship databases. Instead, we're now available to really consume data on an aggregate level without ultimately having to go in and define a field-per-field mapping. And this allows us to then consume hundreds of millions of entries a day for a single database. A lot of these are based on really unique file structures, one of them being JSON files, which really allow for advanced file storage, where every one of your transactions is being entered as a unique queryable file instead of those columns being mapped one for one. And we're seeing that really across the board as an advancement with big data. To really talk about those 3 V's, I know that they can be a little bit confusing, but it is important to keep them in mind when talking about what big data is and what it can give us. And obviously it starts and ends with its sheer volume, thus the name big data, of course. Right now, we're seeing about 1.7 megabytes of data being created per person per second on Earth at this current time. What that really equates to an aggregate level, it's about each day we're seeing 1 billion terabytes of data being created globally. In the future, we're seeing by 2025, that's going to grow by 463 times, giving us 463 exabytes of new data being generated daily. And what that equates to in terms of terabytes is about 463 billion terabytes. So we can see that the data is continuing to balloon and continuing to become bigger and more complex. We're also talking about variety here. So we can have all these different systems being available to collect and consume data to allow us to make aggregate decisions. That data can be delivered in different formats, a different number of columns, so we can consume word-based data, language processing, as well as pictures. So it's not as strict as it once was. And then, of course, we can mix all of that data together and then start to narrow out some of the noise and its variety. And then the other aspect is high velocity. So that's the sheer speed at which data is either being created within an organization or external to your organization, and then the ways it's being consumed. So whether it's being consumed continuously, by batch, or sort of what we call the lulls and spurts, where there might be periods of really no activity, but then when there is activity, it comes in with huge amounts of volume and very quickly. And then, of course, the speed at which your database can ultimately consume that data is incredibly important. And obviously that's driven by a lot of other metrics like CPU usage, data storage in general. And of course, with big data, you really want to integrate your internal ERP data to really gain a holistic picture of the enterprise as a whole, how it's interacting with its suppliers and vendors and the environment in which it exists. You're really allowing yourself to gain those comparative insights across either your business units, your cost centers, or really any other metrics that you want to drive. And it's allowing us to start to see direct interactions between core business and ERP data. And this is allowing us to merge data that was usually kept pretty independently and hard to gain insight cross-comparatively. So things with combining with ERP include sort of our manufacturing resource planning tools, supply chain management tools, and then even our inventory management tools. This allows us to really gain additional insight in our and manage our supplier and counterparty risk through those insights and through the data that we're actually collecting. We can then use all of that to gain a holistic picture of forecasting and our financing requirements for years on end, and really consuming things that really we never would have thought of that could impact our financial forecasting before. Just to give you some of the examples of what big data can do on really an aggregate level, we've included 4 unique use cases that are utilizing different tools across some of the most dynamic aspects of the financial industries. So JP Morgan has used big data to analyze default and credit risk outside of credit scores. So they can actually better analyze the risk of default or the risk of missed payments just based on passive aggregations of external factors. Goldman Sachs utilizes their machine learning capabilities to track trades and settlements for some of the largest trades that they make. And for a lot of us, we know that large scale trades, they can really impact pricing when we're making a single trade. So with Goldman, they use counterparties, portions of their dark pool, as well as direct trade orders on the exchanges. When you do that, you're really linking out 5 or 6 different areas that need to feedback status. So to gain a holistic status update, you really need to aggregate that data from all these different systems to give you a holistic picture of your settlement processes. eBay uses theirs to track all transactions and electronic payment settlements from all orders. And then SoftBank, of course, uses it to track any settlement and look for any fraud in any of their retail credit partners. And these are just some of the big data analytics vendors that are really huge players in the space. So things like Elastic, Lucene Libraries, Hadoop, Power BI, Tableau, a lot of things that we're familiar with and some that we aren't are becoming some of the most powerful players in the arena.
So we just want to provide a few takeaways today from the theme of the presentation. These are some key points. You should be looking at your 1-year, 3-year, 5-year strategic plan and should be incorporating these into those plans. So cloud CaaS and SaaS technology is a true game changer in a post-COVID world. It does allow your team to work remotely. It saves tremendously on costs, and there's a lot of fantastic functionality within those products. RPAs can have a huge ROI through cost savings and automation. Definitely should be incorporating that. I think the statistics was 48% are using, 40% are planning to using. So that's 88% of firms globally, 1,500 firms that were surveyed. Open banking platforms via APIs are changing the world as we know it. Seth talked about this a lot. The major banks are providing APIs and they're perfecting them. And some of the smaller banks are moving forward as well. Fintechs, as we all know, are true disruptors. They are really moving fast and they're creating new products every day. Blockchain payments are real. They are happening now. There's a number of vendors and networks that we provided within the presentation that you can take a look at. And distributed ledger technology has very real applications in the current world. One in particular is in-house banking. AI and machine learning can solve your KYC and fraud challenges if you invest in that. And then, as Dayton pointed out, big data search engines and dashboards will truly give you the global view that you crave. And we have Q&A.
Thank you, Karen and Dayton. We had 2 awesome questions come through that I want to have a chance to answer. So the first one is, are there CPWs, those that allow 1-year forecasts that will perform some type of comparison / reconciliation to FP&A indirect forecasts?
Yes, there definitely is. So the tools are very configurable in the SaaS products that are out there. You really can create 100 different views. So it's just a matter of configuration, and it's really not difficult to learn in the SaaS products. They're quite easy to learn.
The next question is, there seems to be a lag in the use of APIs and KYC at 12%. Would you say this is more due to the banks or corporates being slow to adopt?
So we did a lot of research for this session, and the real issue is that there are not standardization. APIs are little pieces of code. And so a lot of the theme in the presentation was governance and standardization. So until those are truly standardized, it's difficult to roll them out globally, but it is definitely true that the larger banks are taking the lead. All the significant names that you would know, Bank of America, JP Morgan, for example, Wells, they're all working hard to create very legitimate APIs that can be reused globally.
Thank you, Karen. And it looks like we had one more question come through. So is there a source where they can look at more about in-house banking on blockchain? They would like to just see a little bit more how corporations are implementing this technology.
What I recommend, a lot of the information that we gathered does come from AFP. So if you are an AFP member, there's a number of good articles and papers that exist on the AFP website in their library.
Thank you. And that's it for questions for now. If anyone has additional questions, feel free to keep sending them through, and we're able to follow up after the presentation. And I sent through a couple minutes ago the link to the assessment to get CTP and CCM credits. So make sure to click that link and fill out that quiz, as well as I included a link to the next session, which is going to be happening today at 1 p.m. Central Time. And that's going to be an FIS partner session on 2021 Treasury priorities. So feel free to click that link and join us at 1 o'clock. And as well as just keep engaging with Elire on social media. During the Elire Treasury Conference, you can use the ETE2020 hashtag, and we hope to see you at additional sessions coming up over the next 2 days. Thank you so much, everyone.